Welcome, and thank you for coming out this evening. I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of speaking in front of people. Have a bit of a fear of it. But when Ruth asked me to introduce our guest speaker this evening, I immediately got over my fear of speaking. I am a huge fan of Charles Vess, and so it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce him. Interestingly enough, my first encounter with Charles's work was back when I was in graduate studies in creative writing. And a professor suggested that I read Stardust. Sad to say, I hadn't encountered Stardust before then in the graphic novel version. But my professor's like, hey, this would be right up your alley. You're interested in highly illustrated novels. Check it out. So I went to the bookstore, and I found a copy of Stardust. And I immediately fell in love with the cover. And I took it home, and for several weeks, went through it and pored over the illustrations, the line work, the color, everything.
And read the story.
And then my professor called me back in and said, so what did you think of the writing? And I paused and realized at that point I had not read a single word of it. I'm happy to say I did eventually go back and read the story, and I loved it. But that was the wonderful thing about Charles's work, is that it's stories within stories. The illustrations themselves spoke to me, and it was powerful. And I've lost my place.
Doing great.
But he carries this beauty into his illustrations. Pull us in, with twisting branches and intriguing characters, inviting us into the dark forests and beyond mysterious high walls. And he carries this beauty into the various formats that he works in, from graphic novels to picture books. His work has been exhibited in numerous museums and galleries around the world. His newest exhibition, Into the Green, The Art of Charles Vess, is currently on display at the William King Museum in Abington, Virginia. And I highly suggest we all go see it. Because there is a mural there that took him 4 days to work on. He painted it on the wall.
You're going to see it.
And so definitely, if you can, go see it in person. Charles has obviously won numerous awards for his illustrations, including 3 World Fantasy Awards, 2 Will Eisner Comic Industry Awards, and the Inkpot, just to list a few. And so again, I'm very thankful that he's taken time to come here and speak with us tonight. And without further ado, Charles Vess.
Sometimes it's hard to recognize the person they're talking about. Thanks for coming out on the hot, sweaty day that it is. But I thought I would talk about how I ended up being the person that draws stuff like this. Because I grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is about an hour to the east of here, in the 50s and 60s. And there was not much culture there then. There were no museums. There was no art center. There was a fine art center, but it was mostly people painting roses and barns and things like that. Movies were only out of Hollywood, and the biggest blockbuster, Sound of Music played about 6 months. My mother read one book over and over and over and over again, which would be the Bible. My father read car brochures all the time. That's all he ever read. There weren't many kids in my neighborhood. There's nobody to go, oh, what did you just read? Or what did you just find out? Or what art did you just see? I had to stumble on it, which is the title of this whole thing, Stumbling Into Myself. We'll just show a couple of these. So this, if you're not aware, or if you are aware, these are paintings that I've done, or pen and ink drawings for various books. But this is the actual book that I learned art from. My mom had this. It's had a little acid degradation and all over the many years. But it was full of these little postcards. They're really flimsy and really badly reproduced. And if you're at all familiar with this painting, you'll know how retouched they are. But this is what I learned from it. And each, the book had a page on each one of these artists that you could read about. And that was the only kind of art I ever knew. When I finally found this book again, and it's the actual copy I grew up with, I looked through the book and wondered, now why would this be a masterpiece? There are some really funky paintings in it, I have to say, but it was my art. The other things I learned from were Sunday newspaper strips. I grew up with Prince Valiant. Beautiful, beautiful drawing. Total historical inaccuracy through the whole thing, but gorgeously drawn. Another piece. And, you know, my fairy tale input was the Walt Disney films. And back then, of course, this is before internet, this is before YouTube, this is before any of that stuff. And every 7 years, they would re-release one of their films. So here would come Snow White, and you'd watch it, you know. Here would come Pinocchio, and I'd watch it. Sleeping Beauty. You'd have to wait through all the goofy stuff to get the last 20 minutes and all the fun stuff. But it wasn't until much, much later that I found the actual fairy tales that they came from, and then realized how adulterated they were. Every month, my dad would take me to the local barber shop. My uncle owned a shop right next to it, so we'd get a free soda pop and a candy bar, and then we'd go get our hair shorn off. And I would read Donald Duck. I read this. This was in the back of a comic book that I first read at that comic book shop. And when I found the book again, the story, I was just amazed at how influential that one particular panel was. It was, and this came out in the 50s. It was set in a mythical Africa. It was two brothers. One was black, one was white, and they had all these crazy adventures. The Brothers of the Spear is what it's called. And then there were the movies that you would see on TV or at the matinee. I had no idea what this would be when I first went into it, but I went, oh, look, action adventure. They were called Italian sand and sandal epics. Usually they were very cheaply done. But they introduced me to Greek mythology. This was Kirk Douglas' film, Ulysses. You know, wow. Can you say lurid? It's just amazing. But this took me to the library. We had a beautiful library, but I was too shy to talk to the librarians. So there was no one to ask about books. And the books were all those leather bound with the gold stamping. So there was no cover signifier to go, ooh, rocket ship, ooh, you know, dragon. You just had to guess at the books. It took me a lot of years to find things. I finally found the Edith Hamilton with the artist that did these, his name, it somehow just strikes me, it can't be real, but his name is credited as Steel Savage. And I didn't quite like these when I was a kid, but I love them now. You know, and there was the wooden horse. That was really great. But this, somehow or another, I found out that it came from another book. It took me a while to find that book. But before I got to high school, freshman in high school, I'd read the Iliad and the Odyssey. I knew way more about it than the teacher did, and got into a lot of trouble because the teacher just really insisted that it took 20 years to get to Troy and 20 years back, and I damn well knew it didn't. But there was no convincing her. Back at home on the TV, I was watching Tarzan movies. I was obsessed with Tarzan. When I was 11 years old, I had a list of every Tarzan movie ever made, and I was bound and determined to watch them all. I still haven't. Again, pretty lurid. But those, there were comic books with some actually really, really nicely painted covers. And then there were the books. I discovered there were books that they came from, and my parents would buy me. These were hardcovers, And there wasn't a bookstore in town, but there was a newsstand. And you could buy, they would buy me one for Christmas and then one for my birthday in June. So twice a year I would get my Egg Rice Burroughs Tarzan fix. I was pretty obsessed. And then in the early 60s, they started, the publishers found out that Burroughs was public domain and started releasing all these novels. And fortunately for me, the covers were by an artist named Frank Frazetta. And I just, as a 11, 12-year-old boy, it was, you know, perfect. Absolutely perfect. So I followed him, and Roy Krinkle is the other artist that did the covers. This is actually the cover of the very first paperback book I ever bought. It was 40 cents, you know, for that. Roy Krinkle was his name. This is another Frazetta. Here's a Frazetta for a monster magazine. I like this one so much, I decided I'd try to copy it. Pretty crude, but fun. I entered this in, of all things, a Hallmark card contest. Can you imagine what they thought? More Frazetta. Here's me. These were done on, the paper was actually yellow. It was bought from Sears. It was the only kind of art paper my parents could find. And I took a watercolor brush and cut it down to about 6 or 8 bristles and then inked it. And tried to be, you know, my Frazetta monsters, big barbarians, all that stuff. But here was Frazetta again, but this time it was a little more poetic. I'd never heard of Ray Bradbury, but I went, I'm going to buy the book, so let me read the stories. So they were pretty good, you know. So I started reading all the books I could find of his. And I would not be the person I am now without having read those books then. Especially this one. I love this book. And then a lot of years later, I was at San Diego Comic-Con, and this elderly man tried to buy a copy of a book from me. And I realized as I was taking his money, I went, oh my God, that's Ray Bradbury. And at the same time, my wife was putting her elbow into me, and we were like, no, it's your book. So it was pretty fun. But back to the 14-year-old boy. I read this at the barbershop, but it was the first comic book that made me go, I have to own these. So I helped my brother do his newspaper route, earned a little bit of money, and went down to the newsstand and bought. This was the first comic book I ever bought.
Oh my gosh.
There's Spider-Man, which we'll come back to a little later. Then there was Thor. In the back of Thor, of all things, that Jack Kirby was doing these stories, the artist, Tales of Asgard. I never knew that there was any other mythology other than Greek mythology up until that point. Because like I said, I have no friends, and there is no internet, there's no one to ask. I had to stumble into these things, but I went, hey, cool. So every issue he'd do a 5 or 6 page story with the Norse gods and Yggdrasil, which I could not pronounce when I was a kid, in the World Tree. And also in the newspaper, there was an article on 4 young artists that lived in Richmond, Virginia, who were drawing comic books. And I just remember being so totally excited. It never occurred to me that someone I knew or someone that was my age or close to my age could actually be drawing comic books. So I tried to convince my parents to drive the 2 hours it was to get to Richmond, Virginia, and to find these kids, not knowing how sort of ridiculous that was. But here they were, the publisher, and then there's Steve Hickman, who's in the middle there, Michael Kaluta, who was my roommate for 12 years in New York City, and Steve Harper. This is a cover they did for the magazine. This is one of Kaluta's stories. He was adapting Burroughs. And Steve Hickman, King in Yellow. There's also this magazine. Really, really funky, cheap monster magazine that also showed lots of artwork in there, besides all the pictures of the monsters. All that, and they didn't have those goofy puns that Famous Monsters, the film line, had. They took it a little more seriously. And this is besides having the really nice Harry Clark drawing, was one of the first year in horror and fantasy books. It was written by Lynn Carter, who became a really not very good writer, but an excellent editor. So this was my first run-in with him. The magazine also would carry various artists. This is Hannes Bach, Virgil Finley, and George Barr, who was adapting this book I'd never heard of before by Poul Anderson, The Broken Sword. Eventually I'd find a copy of the book to read. They also had this little vignette in there, Aubrey Beardsley. I'd never heard of him before, but I used him. There's my Beardsley imitation and this little imp creature from something, and a guy that has really short legs. I was reading these other stories. I was really enamored of this knight in there, and this text that just remember her face right there, because here's a drawing from high school. There's the knight, and there's Dale Arden. And then art books. Before that, the only art books there were Monet and Van Gogh and all the canon of European artists. And this was the first one that came anywhere close to being art of the fantastic. And I mowed a lot of lawns and bought this book. It was the first of many art books. I discovered this in high school. The artist is Robin Jacques. A really beautiful story that I remember. I haven't reread it since, by Andre Norton. Anyone read it anytime recently? Is it good?
No, I haven't read it recently, but I have it.
Okay. But I stared at this for so many hours in high school. I know it imprinted in my brain. And then at a church retreat, I discovered this album, and I was first attracted by the cover. Then I went, oh, Joan Baez, I like her. But it was her musical interpretations of all these poems, and it just sort of opened up another world for me that I'd never thought of. It's available on CD, and I have it now. Then there were these peculiar covers. And the books were great. I spent hours staring at these covers trying to make sense of them. And I love them now, because I never could make sense of it, but it made it as a whole dialogue between me, the writing, and the art. And that's really how I approach whatever I do now. I love words and pictures working together and creating a sort of third world. But I read the Tolkien, and I tried to do Tolkien in 5 pages. It's incredibly badly lettered, spelled, grammared, and everything else. But it was an effort. I think I was a senior in high school at that point. And then there was these books. These came out after the Tolkien books. And then Lynn Carter came along, and he started releasing under an imprint all these beautiful fantasy novels. This is still one of my favorite books to this day, and I really have sort of made a promise to myself that I will illustrate this one day. And all these are wonderful novels to read. And The Broken Sword, here again, popping up again. The same artist that did that splash page did this cover. And the story is really a very interesting fantasy story. Evangeline Walton, beautiful books. One of the other things, besides the books being lovely, he had some really interesting introductions in them, and then the art was all vastly different one from the other. Unlike today, that seems like the same person has done 90% of the covers on the newsstands. And then I won a art contest. I got $15 gift certificate at the record store. You know record stores? Anyone ever shopped at one?
Yes.
So I went there. You could buy 3 albums at that time. And I was really hung up on the Moody Blues at the time, so I got 2 Moody Blues albums, and then I went, I want to get something I have no idea what it is. And I went looking through the store, and I came across this, and I liked the art. It was Albrecht Dürer, did the older artist, did that. But then I read the titles of the songs and went, those sound interesting, and took it home and I listened to it, and it totally changed my life. I never knew there was music like this. I went on to Steel Eye Span and Fairport Convention and many, many other musical artists. All were doing stories that had fantasy and magic in them that I loved in the songs. Another newspaper strip, this was from about 1910, but it was reprinted. It struck a thunderbolt in me. Same time, a girlfriend of mine handed me this, said, you ought to read this book. It's still brilliant. And then they started publishing art books. Most of these art books at that time, this would have been out in 1970, most of them are in black and white. The color was not that good, but it was exciting to see these artists that you might have seen one or two pictures by beforehand. Howard Pyle and N.C. Wyeth. Arthur Rackham, this was a revelation to me. This is one of his paintings. He was a British illustrator, did line and watercolor. Still probably my biggest influence, him and John Bauer. Just gorgeous. And a couple of years ago I went to Sweden and went to the museum, the John Bauer Museum, and took the walk on the John Bauer Trail and saw a lot of really nice art. Back in art school, I'm in art school right now in Richmond, Virginia, and it was fine arts, and if you put a figure into a piece, they laughed at you. And you just didn't want to be there for a critique of it. So I started doing bizarre sort of surrealistic landscapes that were inspired
Crazy.
by Crazy Cat. They didn't know that, of course. They just thought I was being weird, and everyone kept saying, did you take acid this weekend? No, I just read Crazy Cat. This was a piece I did right out of art school, trying to capture the fantasy and the magic. I think, what's the title of this? When Granny Goodapple comes knocking on your door. There could be a fun story there. At the same, about this time, this came out, and it was, I never heard of these people, but I went, oh, well, that looks interesting, and the stories were, again, a revelation of, because at the same time, the fantasy novels that were available were basically I read Tolkien, and I'm going to tell it again, only better, with more war. It's not a lot of fun. That I read one or two of them and then threw them across the room in disgust and tried to find other things to read. But this was, this had all these writers, old and new, that were really good. I moved to New York in 1976. This was the first painting I did while I was there, and it was inspired by a novel that Lynn Carter came out of that line. It's Joy Chance, Red Moon, Black Mountain, and I just loved the image, the Earth Witch image, and I just did the painting, hoping to sell it one day. At this time, I would complain to my roommate, who was very established and getting lots of work. I said, all I can do is draw and paint the things I want to paint. I need to make some money. And he would laugh at me and go, remember you said that, Charles, because one day you'll be so busy you won't be able to paint the things you want to paint.
Could you split that back a second so I can take a picture
Which one?
to elsewhere?
Okay.
Thanks.
And eventually at Marvel, I got a chance to do Spider-Man. I sent him to Scotland because I wanted him in a place, he's usually associated with New York City, and I wanted him a place where he couldn't swing away from bad people. And besides, I wanted to go to Scotland and write it off my taxes. Right after that, I did illustrated William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. And this was what Neil Gaiman saw and asked me if I wanted to try a different interpretation of Midsummer. So, we did the issue 19 of Sandman, Midsummer Night's Dream. He wanted Puck to be a psychotic monkey. And I wanted Oberon to be 9 foot tall with red armor and horns. So, you know, we both had our wishes. A Swamp Thing cover, big muck monster, it was fun to do. This was Stardust. This was done before there was any book or much, maybe a page and a half of writing. So there's all sorts of stuff in here. I always wanted to know, there's a Puss in Boots character right here. And there's a raven with a little imp on it and a key, and I always wondered what that key would open up. But I might not ever find out. And these characters back here, these bizarre historic characters, were the first interpretation of the Lords of Stormhold. So, again, this was very influenced by John Bower. And if you look closely, you can see the trolls down here. Trees coming to life, trolls, faces, all sorts of stuff going on. This was done much later, but it's still for Stardust. One of the stray sentences in the back that weren't illustrated. And then I did a bunch of ballad books, and this was a crazy idea. The ballads that started with my love of the Pentangle and Cruel Sister. And it occurred to me one day that they would make great comic book stories. Why don't I do that? So I self-published them, and then they've been printed around the world in various places. This is The Demon Lover, Delia Sherman's text. Jane Yolen. This is Anne Boleyn. And this is Henry VIII. Well, just in case you were wondering. A bunch of years later, this is actually an illustration from Storm of Swords, the George Martin book. I illustrated a limited edition of it. There are only 400 copies, and they go for thousands of dollars now. So, if you find one in a used bookstore, snap it up. This is one of those god trees with the bloody mouth and all the zombie guys, whatever he calls them, I don't remember now. And Sam Tarley, the woman. This is from another Neil Gaiman book, Blueberry Girl. I'd just seen the movie Whale Rider. I went, ooh, what a good idea, I'll use those whales. Another book with him called Instructions, and there are 4 and 20 blackbirds in that tree. And to me, this for me is Rumpelstiltskin cackling away. Just a painting I did for myself, and if anyone's familiar with the character, animated movie character Totoro, he's right there. And then there's a nice fox crawling up there. This was a piece I did, and then it inspired both a short story and a longer one that was published online at Tor.com. Father Christmas stories that are vastly different than what you would normally associate with Father Christmas. In my stories, there are 12 daughters. All sorts of other things happen. This is a painting I just did for commission, and I don't think there's a Totoro. Not in that one. I also do sculpture. This is a 16-foot tall bronze fountain in the middle of Abingdon, Virginia. There it is with all the, there's a tortoise and a hare. This is Puck, this is Titania, and then a lot of fairies and some foxes, various things. It's 3 years of work doing that. Another book I did with Charles Vess, The Cats of Tanglewood Forest. There's Tanglewood Forest, which is right across the street from where I live. Here's the old mother possum. Delint knows how much I hate possums. And he put this character in there. It was just delightful. I know he was chuckling the whole time he wrote it. And I had a good time drawing her, but I still hate possums. The Apple Tree Man, having tea. The 7 wild sisters blowing away across the hills. I'll just keep on going. I've been doing a lot of illustrations for Fairy Magazine. And I've worked with Alice Hoffman a couple times and Joanne Harris and all sorts of people, but this was for Gregory Maguire's story. They were Baba Yaga stories. And I did 2 pictures for this one. There's her hut. In black and white, this is in the coloring book. Another piece. Now, years later, Melissa Marr asked me to be involved in an anthology, and all the writers were doing stories based on books or stories that had changed their life when they were younger. So I thought I would use the Lynn Carter edited books, assigned to Unicorn Books, and do drawings for them. I did 6 of them. These are 2 of them. And I did a James Branch Cabell and some other people whose names are escaping me. I also do local work. This is a music festival that happens in Bristol. This will be this September. There's all sorts of little characters in there. One of my latest projects is they're collecting all 6 of Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books under one cover, and I'm illustrating all of them. And it's the first time it's ever been done, and I'm having a really good time communicating with Ursula and finding out her philosophy of dragons and all the things she doesn't like, because I can't draw anything she doesn't like.
Like what?
Dragons that look like typical dragons, so that's out. I have to do something else. They're all humans and dragons are descended from one being, and she told me this whole philosophy, and then went, and I have no idea how you draw that, Charles, but I'm looking forward to seeing it. Good, so am I. This is the biggest drawing, and it's nowhere near finished yet. Been a lot of back and forth with her. And this is a book, I'll talk more about this on Sunday morning. Sunday morning?
Tomorrow.
Well, tomorrow, but there's Sunday with
With Gail Brown.
Gail Brown. This is a book I'm doing with Erdman, and these are the rough sketches for it. And it's a cycle of seasons. This stick that the beaver has falls down in the water and flows away and goes down the stream. And I was talking about this at dinner. I've put some graphic narrative elements in it. It seemed to work really well, give the movement to things. The stick gets stuck in the rocks and then freezes over and goes through the winter. Goes through all the seasons, and the stick eventually goes to the ocean and becomes driftwood and gets picked up by the same boy again. There's the ocean. Seagulls like it. Gets picked up by a fishing boat and thrown back into the water and goes to the shore. And the boy picks it up and draws all sorts of stuff in the sand. And this is going to be a quick, this is the exhibition that's happening at the William King in Abington, Virginia. And one of the things I wanted to do with it was to make a piece of art that is only going to be at that exhibition. And I designed and then painted a 12-foot by 150-foot narrative mural it'll be painted over at the end of the show. And this is to come into it. I'll show you some other stuff first. I've had all sorts of conversations lately with people who seem to think that I think that dragons are real and various things. And they take everything so literally that I was just really, I thought I'd be very pointed. Like, metaphor, those are the metaphors. So this is the show, the paintings. There's about a dozen paintings in the show, some done just specifically for it. These white tables have slide projections. This has got a retrospective of my work, and the other table has all my influences. So, and I finally finished the 4 seasons of The Green Man. This is the Summer King and His Bride of Flowers. And there's all sorts of, it's kind of blurry, so it'd be hard, but there's mice right here. There's ladybugs, honeybees, there's some robins, and there's a bluebird, and there's cows. These landscapes are the landscape you see if you sit on my front porch. And all four of them are the same landscape, just in the different seasons. And my wife really likes the wild turkeys that are across the street. And I went, well, you're not going to really be able to tell what they are, but you're going to know because I'm going to tell you that these little blobs are wild turkeys. So this is the summer one. Each one has a table with some poetry underneath of it. This is Mary Oliver sleeping in the forest that I hand calligraphied and designed and all that kind of stuff. This is the Prince of Spring. And this was a poem that Ari Burke, a really good writer, did sort of reworked for me. This is the Winter King, which the show was opening on a Thursday night, and there was still 3/4 of the mural to be done, and this painting. And I asked everyone at the museum, should I finish this painting or should I finish the mural? And they all went, do the mural. So it's not painted yet. This is the Winter King. There's the winter wren on top of a acorn in snow. There's all sorts of symbology all through the thing. Again, that's the landscape with the snowy trees. And that's the poem. It's the Susan Cooper poem. Who wrote The Dark is Rising, those books. And this is the Corn King, the autumn one. And all the leaves and the tree limbs are trees that my wife and I planted in our yard. And the corn was out of our garden, and the landscape was across the street, and I don't know where the guy came from. And I used the traditional verses for Lord of the Dance. Another piece, this is, you might have noticed, let's see, I've got a picture of it. You can see the banners here, they go behind the floating ark. The colors there are based on this painting. So the blue to red transition. This is called Gathering the Worlds. Here's the actual piece. This is looking across the gallery at a 4 by 8 foot watercolor or colored ink. And this is an actual piece. It's called The Reconciliation of the Sun and of the Moon. This is a little piece I started as a demo for a workshop I did in Seattle. It's a gift, the Owl's Gift. I actually did put a little poster of it. And I like doing pieces like this. This is based on no story, but it's got a narrative feel to it. And I'm hoping that people look at that and make up their own story. So there could be hundreds of stories based on this one picture. And I think the best thing you can do as a writer or as an artist is to collaborate with the person reading or looking at your art, and the more you can make them participate in the piece of art, the better it will be. This is again looking across the gallery at the mural. There's a painting that I did a pretty elaborate framework for. This is Once and Future King, and it's got there's Merlin with an owl. There's a snake up here for Mordred. There's foxes because I like foxes. And this was at a illustration master's class, and everyone had, this was one of the things, the sword and the stone they could do, or the Once and Future King. And I just kept suggesting, why isn't she standing on thousands of river trout? And why isn't the sword really huge? And why is she holding it like it's a baby? And all these things. And nobody took me up on all this stuff because they would have had to gone back and photographed and had people pose. And it wasn't something they could do. So I just did it. I drew it there in the class. I downloaded a picture of the trout, and then I just drew it. And here. And at first I was thinking this was going to be a starry night, but I got into some reds down here and I started going, sunset, sunset, it's Camelot. Because he's going to take that sword and use it for, to smite all of his enemies, he's going to bring about the destruction of Camelot. So, sunset's good symbology. Again, this is a look. That's the only illustration that's in the whole show. The rest of it's paintings I've done for myself. But this is the mural. It's a narrative mural. It reads from right to left. The lettering is my font that's been made into sticky vinyl that's put on the wall. And then and you just follow it all along. The pictures are not that great. This actually has the best color. It's a light green wall with a dark green silhouette. And these were all done in like 3 days, 3.5 days. I spent it all the time up on a ladder. And by the time the opening happening, I had to ask them to bring me a chair because I went, I'm not tired, but my feet hurt really badly. Can I sit down, please? Oops. What's that doing there? Okay, I'm going down the wall. There's it for scale. You know, it's big. And it just goes all the way around the gallery, and it's following the path through the dark woods, and all the things it can tangle your mind up with.
Huh.
That's the dragon coming up out of the earth. I think there's a close-up, yeah. It was really fun to paint this. The wall is very textured, and you couldn't, I really realized very quickly that I couldn't paint the way I would normally paint, that I had to adopt and improve as quickly as humanly possible. This was painted about 2 hours before the opening. So it was like, go, go, go. Gesture, it's good. I'm looking forward to, I really enjoyed the way it looks, and I'm looking forward to seeing what this will inform in paintings I do for myself. I think these are a couple close-ups. Very gestural. They're really fun to do. If the time pressure hadn't been so much, it would have been more fun. That's some of the dragon coming up. I did a sketch. It was 1 inch to the 1 foot, so it was 12 inches high and 15 feet long, and then we just translated it onto the wall freehand. So. Just like that. I'm sure you can all do that. We've got a wall right here. Let's paint one.
Let's go.
I think yeah, that's it. If you've got any questions, holler out.
How long will the exhibit be there?
It'll be there till September 27th.
Oh, good.
If you buy a, I've got some anyway, but if you buy one of the coloring books, it's got the invitation card inside of it with all the information on it. They're open 7 days a week. It's a nice museum.
How did the fountain come to be in Abington? Did you approach
They
Abington?
asked.
Yeah.
The Richard Rose, who's the artistic director of the Bardo Theater, said, Charles, I want you to design us a fountain. Get back to me with a drawing. So, I love Midsummer, and I'll play with that. And it was just a couple days to do the drawing, and then they were like, yes. And then there was 3 years of a lot of work. I even poured bronze and all that stuff. It was an amazing process. It's really complex. You have to do the bronze. Any questions? Yes.
Well, I'm choked up because you kind of went through my life too. It's weird that we, like, of all the albums we had, we would have the same one and all that stuff. And I'm just wondering if there was stuff that, meant a lot to you and me, but that wouldn't necessarily to some of the folks in here. you know, who weren't there when you were, like Pentangle and the folk music. So was that the first time you really encountered traditional, I'm talking about the Pentangle
You know,
album.
I grew up, you know, I watched Hullabaloo and Shindig and Ed Sullivan, and so you'd gotten a little bit of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary, I guess, all those kind of things. And they had been interesting, but I hadn't had the albums. I didn't really make, all my money went to buying comic books. I couldn't buy albums. So, I didn't, you know, never heard any of the songs that they did. So this was the first time like, oh my God, look, this is exactly what I like to read. So, yeah, it just kind of changed. But again, it was, there's nobody else I knew that knew who Pentangle was. There was nobody I knew of to ask going, well, if I like this, what else can I like? It was just stumble around till you find something and read on the back of it going, oh, these songs sort of sound like the same kind of things that were over there. And then, you know, you buy a Steel Eye Span. Or, you know, and it wasn't until there was some fanzine that Charles DeLint was publishing that they talked about Legion Leaf, the Fairport Convention. And it was like, oh, okay, let me try that. You know, but it was, I didn't go to conventions. I didn't have that many friends. The ones I did didn't read this kind of stuff, so it was, you just had to figure it out. You couldn't, you know, get on your chat group and go, hey, I like this, what else is there? And then you get 100 suggestions nowadays. So I don't know whether that's good or bad, it's just the way it was. So, yeah, it's, you know, it just was a different world. And nowadays, to find any of these artists, you can, you know, if you hear a name, you can type it in and you can get 100, 200 images, and there it all is. And that ease of access is really fun, but also one of the other reasons I wanted to paint that mural was I remember finding out that one of my favorite paintings, The Lady of Shalott by John William Waterhouse, was in London. I went, okay, so I wrote and drew a Spider-Man story. I took the money, I flew to London, I figured out how to ride the tube, I figured out how to get from the tube to the Tate Gallery, and I got in the Tate Gallery and I sat there, and there was a Lady of Shalott on one side of the door, and Ophelia, John Millet's Ophelia on the other, and I spent a couple hours going. And you know, it's partly you see an original piece of art and you begin to have a conversation with the painter, whereas that doesn't really happen when you see it online. But also you realize that effort made it even better. That it was something you really wanted and you went there and you got it. And ease of access sometimes is just easy, so it doesn't feel like it's worth anything. So I think, I don't know, that's my guess.
Could you talk about the writing that you're doing now? 'Cause I'm
Well, they're words. They follow each other sometimes. I've been, I guess the last 10 or 15 years saying, why not? I used to just, you know, I would just do comic books, then I was just doing illustration. Then it was like, well, let me try sculpture. And anything I did that was outside of my normal venue seemed to, when I went back to what I usually did, it expanded it, made it more interesting to me. And I love to read. I've got, Lord knows, I've got a lot of books. So I used to write. I have a whole little treasure trove full of stories that I wrote in high school that are as close as I could possibly get to being Ray Bradbury. They're excruciating to try and read them, but I love that I have them, and no one will ever see them. You know? And I've always written some, and a lot of it, you know, as any person who does any kind of arts, right? The more you do it, the better you get at it, the more things you learn. You've got to make mistakes before you can get better at it. And you've got to carry a big eraser. Editing tool, best thing you'll ever have. You know, your beautiful baby, if it doesn't work in that sentence, you get rid of it. It's just, you know, I did animation for a while. I remember working on it was a 2.5 minute film that it took me 2.5 years to work on, that probably had 15 or 20,000 drawings in it. And there was a whole long sequence that I spent a long time drawing that, and it looked really pretty, and it was so totally out of place. It did not belong in that story. And it took me a long time to go, okay, just cut it out, get rid of it. And the film was way better once it was gone. But you know, it's the whole kill your baby. You've got to be able to do it. And yes.
I was looking at some of your incredible work. For example, the Summer King and the Bride of Flowers,
Yes.
as well as the Prince of Spring, the Winter King. And I'm noticing the theme that you spoke in reference to of the landscape
Mm-hmm.
and the symbolism with the tree.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you could speak in reference to why the tree is so prominent in a lot of your work. The tree is powerful in itself when you think of roots and all of that. I was just wondering if there was something, if you could speak in reference to the tree, but if there was something also that would substitute for the tree in the natural landscape of the world, what would it be?
A rock, a boulder, a mountain. Really, anything. It's that whole. There was a really nice book on some Scottish women artists I really liked, and it was called Part Seen, Part Imagined. And to me, that is what all art should be. That you should see some of it, and then it make you think a lot about it and participate with it. And to me, that's a tree. You're only seeing part of it. You know, there's a lot of roots down in that ground, and I look at them, and I'll be talking about this in the workshop tomorrow, imagining it starting in the acorn or whatever it is, and growing up, and maybe it being in a crack of a rock and splitting the rock when it gets bigger. You just imagine it living and growing and telling its own stories and stuff. And it's just something I've always done, and I like doing it, and I do it a lot when I'm sitting there just imagining why that's the way it is. You know, how it grew there, or what it lived there. And I like growing things better than inanimate things. I have a really hard time drawing modern cities or automobiles or airplanes. It's a real effort for me to do it. I'll do it, but I would rather be drawing the natural world. It makes me happy, so why not be happy?
Here, here.
Yes.
What medium do you use primarily when you work?
I draw on the cheapest paper possible for my sketches, so you won't be intimidated by the paper. And then I transfer it onto the paper I want and redraw it and erase whatever I want to do. And then I ink it outline it in ink. Normally, and then I would paint over that with colored inks, FW inks. They are an acrylic-based liquid, and you can glaze, put 15, 20 coats of color. I don't have any skill or knowledge of color wheels or any of that stuff. I just start putting colors down so they look good, and when I'm satisfied, then that's it. That's what I did. There's.
I'm just curious, we've been having labs on how to do Photoshop lately.
Uh-huh.
A lot of us, I'm just curious, do you ever do Photoshop on your...
Sort of. Sometimes I put rosy cheeks on people, because boy is it easy in Photoshop. It takes hours sometimes to get just the right glow on a cheek. Sometimes if I've dropped a big block of paint on something with a transparent medium, the only way to correct that is with an opaque medium, and that color will never match. It looks funny. So I just don't fix it on the original, because it usually looks okay on the original. But for publication, I will, if there's too big of a block, I just take it out in Photoshop. I don't use it I use it to scan pieces, to send it online. It's really, really comforting not to have to send your originals off to a publisher who then sends them off to a printer who doesn't care one whit about your art and is not going to take care of it. So if you can just send that digital file, it's really nice. So, there's some things I like about the modern world. Yes?
What sizes do you like to work in?
For
The
you.
older I get, the bigger I like. It's true. But that sort of drives me crazy because right now I'm working on this book for Erdman, the Driftwood Days, the cycle of seasons. And I've done these drawings, they're about this big, and there are 44 of them. And they would take 4 to 6 11 by 17 scans each, and then you'd have to put them together. And I just look at it and go, I'm not doing that. I'd much rather paint. So that's what I do. I'd love to have a 64-inch flatbed scanner, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
They have one in Richmond. It's very nice. Anything else?
One more question.
Well, we got 2 more questions.
Oh,
Let the other person answer.
Mine is not that big, but I was just wondering what particular shade of red you use, because I don't always like red as a color, but the one that you use next to the blue.
There are
I
5 or
love.
6 colors in the FWs that are red, and I just mix them all. I usually take the inks and
More specific.
no, there's no specific. I dilute them and I layer them on there, and then I'll maybe take another red and dilute that and write it on there. The other thing I've discovered, and this is only in the last couple of years, is the FW inks are an acrylic suspended medium. So if you don't shake it up, usually you should shake it up, so it'll be all the same consistency. But if you don't shake it up, and you take your brush and you go down to the bottom, there's some great sludge down there. And you can just take it and use it almost like wash. So it's just all sorts of stuff you can do with it. And the color, they have, what are they? Crimson and earth red and all sorts of fakey names, but they're really cool. I just look at them and go, oh, that looks good, that looks good. And then have 4 or 5 of them and mix them around. I never want to use the same color over the same color. I like to modulate. And you'll make little mistakes and it'll look more interesting.
So it's Charles Vess red.
Yes. There we go. You can have Maxfield Parrish blue and Charles Vess red. Come on, Tino. What do you got?
Well, I was just going to ask if you've done any other big murals before this exhibit.
No. I've done design things.
So was there any influence of having done the brick sculpture of the Jacktail Wall when you went to do this big mural? Then?
Well, that was a very different
That's obviously a different form. But no, it's thinking big, and it's really fun to work. I was talking with Lauren some about that, working really big and using your whole arm to draw, your whole body to draw, and it feels good to do that. And it's interesting. It takes longer, and then what do you do with it? I've got some big 4 by 8 foot charcoal drawings. And when you have to frame them, you start cursing yourself. It's a lot of work. But you shouldn't worry about the practical. You should just do it and draw from your heart and do the stories that you want to tell. Don't look at market. Don't decide, oh, that's popular, let me write that or draw that or paint whatever. Just do what you want to draw. Tell the story you want to tell. Because we want to read it.
And with that, those words of wisdom.
Okay.